Simon Birmingham, welcome to the program. Why do you think China has done this to Australian wine exporters?
Well, David, this is one of a number of actions that we have seen now. There's a cumulative effect there dating back over quite a period of time, indeed going potentially all the way back a couple of years ago when China instigated its investigation into the barley industry that led to anti-dumping duties being applied there and a range of other adverse decisions. So I can well and truly understand why the perception is growing, particularly off of the back of the remarks that China's ambassador made in Australia earlier this year, that there are other factors driving this beyond those claims of dumping or the like that China makes. Because we know that Australia's wine producers, far from dumping their product in China, actually get their best price per litre in the Chinese market compared with any of their other export markets. So we are a high-priced wine exporter into China, and our wine producers do this at an incredibly good job in terms of providing high quality, high value wine at an entirely commercial level, and that's why we will stand with them in fighting these claims of dumping.
So if there are other factors at play here, as you say, what are those factors? Are you going to call this out?
David, we do see a much more aggressive or assertive China in terms of the way it engages with the world. Now, Australia welcomes the fact that China is more economically prosperous. The Prime Minister made that clear again just in the last week, that we are very welcoming of the fact that China has grown enormously as an economy, lifted hundreds of millions of people in their own country and across our region out of poverty. This is good news, and unlike other parts of the world, we want to see China continue to grow and economically prosper. But we also want to make sure that across our region, all nations engage in a way that is respectful of the sovereignty of one another and supports and underpins the peaceful development and prosperity of our region.
Yeah, okay, and we accept that's the Australian position, but what's going on here from China? They've hit our barley, our beef, our lobsters, our timber, our coal, now our wine. What are these other factors? Is this economic coercion?
Look, it's a matter for Chinese authorities to explain what is driving this, but the fact that we see such a consistent flow of events means that I well and truly understand that perception and that understanding that is taking hold, not just in Australia, but around the world. And this is why I would urge Chinese authorities...
Sorry, Minister, to jump in. I'm just wanting to come back to this question. Is it your view now that this is economic coercion from China? Will you call it for what it is?
David, I think right around the world people are posing that question, and I understand absolutely why. And it really is, though, a matter for Chinese authorities to speak plainly and clearly about what it is that is driving this consistent trend of actions.
But will you speak plainly and clearly as to how you view this?
Well, David, I view this as something that we want to resolve. So I'm not going to escalate it in my language. I'm going to work as hard as we can to resolve it. Australia has not changed. Australia is still a nation that supports the free flow of trade and goods according to the international rules and norms that not only we have committed to, but China has committed to as well. We support the flow of foreign investment into our country on the same terms as long as it's in the national interest, as we always have. And we're not going to change any of those things, and we have not changed. We do see, though, the fact that China, with the welcome rise of its economy, has also become more assertive in other ways. And what we want to see is that assertiveness channeled into good, into engaging in ways with the rest of the world that helps to drive economic growth rather than dampens it. And these types of actions don't just hurt Australian businesses, they hurt their Chinese counterparts as well. They undermine confidence in the global economy, and that's not good for the world's recovery from COVID, not just our own.
When you were on this program 6 months ago, I asked if you'd mount a dispute through the World Trade Organization against China. That was in relation to barley. You said you would have a look at it. Are you still thinking about it now? Will you finally take China to the World Trade Organization?
That is now a point that we are actively discussing and resolving with industry representatives. So in the interim, we had to go through a period, or we chose to go through a period of using China's domestic processes. There was an appeal mechanism that we could apply, and out of respect for those processes, we sought to engage in good faith. Again, we're disappointed at the fact that all of the evidence, compelling as we are confident it is was rejected by Chinese authorities, and that appeal was unsuccessful. So now the WTO appeal for barley is the next step. We are engaging there with the grains industry and other sectors to make sure we have strong industry buy-in and support.
What are they saying? Does the barley industry want you to lodge this case?
Look, there are different opinions, to be quite frank there, but on the whole, Australia stands by the rules-based system for international trade. And if you stand by the rules-based system, you should also use that rules-based system, which includes calling out where you think the rules have been broken and calling in the international umpire to help resolve those disputes.
That sounds like an argument for doing it. That sounds like an argument for doing it.
And I expect that is the process that we will go through with, David, as we've said right from the moment that decision was handed down.
You expect you will
rights to go through that. I expect that will be the outcome, but we're working through just exactly how, when, and making sure we have all of the evidence lined up. Just in the last week, through the Trade in Goods Committee at the World Trade Organisation, Australia outlined quite seriously our range of concerns that we have in terms of this accumulation of instances from China of adverse trade decisions against Australia. We do see those as a very concerning development, as I said, and we are calling them out through the WTO, whilst also still using all of those processes in the Chinese system to try to resolve them. But ultimately, these are Chinese decisions. China has chosen to apply them on Australia, and only China can choose to reverse them.
Okay, just to be clear though, you're talking about barley, that the case would be in relation to not wine.
So the wine dispute, this is a interim application of tariffs at the very early stage of the anti-dumping investigation. So we still have parts of that Chinese process that we have to work through before we could get to the point of a WTO dispute there.
Okay. Can I just, in response to, we heard from one winemaker earlier, this view that the Australian government has gone too hard on some fronts, like calling for the inquiry into the coronavirus origins, even in the last week or so, overselling a reciprocal access agreement, defence agreement with Japan as some, something more than it is. What do you say to that criticism that perhaps Australia's rhetoric and indeed actions has been over the top?
We'll take the reciprocal access agreement with Japan as an example. That had been something we've been negotiating for many years. So the fact that it has come to a point of finality right now shouldn't be read into these issues, because it is something that Australia has been working on with a close partner like Japan for a very long period of time. It's a little over a week ago that we saw the apparent circulation of a list of some 14 concerns by allegedly the Chinese embassy in Canberra. And now firstly, I'd say that's certainly not the way that our embassy in Beijing operates. But secondly, I'd make the point that topics on that, like the way we handle foreign investment or the way we protect our communications or security infrastructure and our national security policy settings, these aren't things that we will change for any country in the world. These are things that we have consistently applied as a nation. I emphasise again, Australia hasn't changed there. We still welcome foreign investment, and we still welcome and have an open rules-based trade approach to things. It is other nations who have changed their approach, or in this case, particularly the way China is disrupting that trade. Just
on another trade front, you'll soon wrap up in the portfolio, so keen for your thoughts on quite a shift that's happening in globally when it comes to trade. Europe is now drafting a policy for a carbon border tax on imports. It'll be finalised next year. Certainly Joe Biden in the United States has signalled a similar approach to punish climate laggards through trade means. If Australia doesn't embrace a net zero by 2050 target, are we ultimately going to be punished? Are our exporters going to pay a price?
I think Australia is actually very well placed in these discussions, David. So just in the last week, Prime Minister Morrison had leaders-level dialogue with the leaders of the European Union. That was a very positive engagement. It helped to advance further our free trade agreement negotiations with Europe. We talked about the opportunities for climate change collaboration there, particularly in relation to technology collaboration. But in terms of measures that might assess how Australia stacks up in terms of our reductions of emissions, well, we stack up very well. We've reduced emissions by levels greater than Canada or New Zealand, for example. And we've actually gotten on with the job of meeting and exceeding our commitments that we've made.
But do you think failing to agree to this net zero target by 2050 will ultimately cost Australia?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister's been clear, and indeed he made this clear in discussions with the EU, that we want to see net zero as soon as possible. That's what we are striving towards, and that could be earlier than 2050. But what we have to do is make sure we all have a clear plan on how to get there,
but we haven't set the target,
how to deliver
is the
the
point.
Technologies.
Sorry, but the point I'm trying to make, we haven't set the target. I think that everyone understands that we haven't set the target. Do you agree with that? Do you think we should set that target?
David, we've set a 2030 target, and we've committed to the Paris Agreement that also commits us to then setting targets every 5 years.
No, but I'm asking you about the net zero by 2050 target, Minister.
No, but I'm just telling you what we have done, and in that Paris Agreement, committed to net zero by the second half of the century. We've said we want to do it as early as possible. You've asked me in a trade context what that means. In a trade context, what I see is that Australia is very, very well placed in our engagement with other countries because of the scale of our investment, the record levels of renewables energy uptake in Australia, the fact that our reductions in emissions in Australia exceed many other countries, and our achievements in relation to delivering on Kyoto 1 and Kyoto 2, and what we will do in relation to the Paris Agreement as well.
Now, as Finance Minister, let me ask you about your predecessor, Matthias Cormann. How much has the government committed to supporting his bid to become Secretary-General of the OECD?
We have stood up within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade a central unit that helps to run our candidacies, that helps to ensure that when Australia puts figures forward for key roles in the world, we do it with the commitment to win and succeed. That recently helped secure Natasha Stott-Despoja a win in terms of the Committee for the Elimination of Domestic Violence Against Women, an important win that we had in that regard. Now, in terms of the OECD, we're in it to win it as well. Australia is the 13th largest economy in the world. We ought to be playing on the world stage in a serious way.
And I'll come to that,
the OECD,
what the job would mean. But one bit you left out is the RAF VIP flight that's been made available to him to jet around Europe. I mean, how long's he got that for? And coming back to the question I asked, how much has been committed to this?
Well, David, I was outlining there. So there's personnel in a standing unit that is there within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to support these types of candidacies. Yes, we've deployed a RAF flight for Matthias Cormann to be able to access the various members of the OECD. There are 10 candidates running for this. 7 of those 10 candidates are from Europe. Matthias is the only candidate from the Southern Hemisphere. He's the only candidate from the Asia-Pacific region. In fact, the OECD has never been led by a candidate from the Asia-Pacific region
So
before.
what do we get out of it? What does Australia benefit
firmly
here? If we already have an ambassador to the OECD, they're the ones who make the decisions. What's the benefit for Australia of having the Secretary-General an Australian?
Well, the Secretary-General helps to set and drive the leadership and strategic direction of the OECD. The OECD brings together 50% of the world's economies, roughly. Those economies are liberal democracies like Australia, and at a time of the post-COVID recovery, at a time of the type of tensions and geopolitical challenges that our region, the most dynamic region in the world, but also the one with the greatest strategic challenges in the world at present, ought to be taking on leadership roles. And that's why we think that given the Asia-Pacific has never led the OECD before, this is the opportunity for us to shape its direction in the future. The OECD helps to shape policies right across the globe through all of those economies. Its work in terms of tax policies, environmental policies, a range of different measures that help to provide analysis and standards that inform the budgets and approaches that global leaders take.
But in terms of the budget
as
here,
the policy machine for the G20 are all crucial roles, and Matthias Cormann is very well placed to make sure our nation's interests and our region's challenges are well understood
but just
in
to be
those
clear,
policy settings.
You don't know how much has been committed here?
It's a mixture, David. So it is partly the resourcing of personnel. Many
What's
of
the
those
total?
existing
What's the
personnel. David, all of that will be made clear through the usual processes. There's no secret about the fact that there is a plane in Europe. That's well known. That will be published and reported by the Department of Defence in the usual way.
All right. So you don't know right now?
I think it's a very small Australia attitude. If you're questioning or others are implying that somehow we shouldn't be contesting these races.
I'm just asking on behalf of taxpayers what this costs.
And when we
hear the Prime Minister shocked and appalled about watches at Australia Post. I'm just wondering what the cost is here. You don't know?
And when we contest these races, we should be in it to win it. There's no point putting an Australian candidate forward and then running a half-baked campaign. Right. We're running a proper campaign because we believe that the influence of this position in the OECD is important in terms of the future policy settings for the post-COVID recovery.
Okay, final one. It's the last couple of weeks of Parliament coming up. You're now the government Senate leader as well. One of the bills that is expected to go through is the Foreign Relations Bill. Gives the Commonwealth the power to veto, to terminate state government or university agreements with foreign powers. One of the concerns Labor has is whether you'll publish the reasons for terminating an agreement. Is that fair enough? Will you do that?
David, the Foreign Minister, Senator Payne, has been working through the responses to the inquiry that was held. We're looking to get bipartisan support in relation to the passage of this. We see it very much like, though, the way in which the Treasurer assesses foreign investments against the national interest, that equally there ought to be a similar type of standard that when states, territories or other bodies want to engage with foreign powers and foreign governments, there ought to be a role for the Foreign Minister in leading Australia's foreign policy to be able to ensure that those sorts of agreements are in the national interest. Of course, the Foreign Minister is always subject to the scrutiny of the Parliament, of Senate estimates, of all of those processes, so there's plenty of avenues to scrutinise those decisions in the future.
All right, Finance Minister, Trade Minister, Tourism Minister Simon Birmingham, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.